Welcome to the podcast, Prime Minister. It is such an enormous pleasure to have you on Inside Politics.
Good to be here. Welcome to my office.
Well, it's very comfortable and commodious. Thank you. Now, I want to start with something a bit different. I want to take you back to the Canterbury Helston Park RSL in May last year. I was there. You were there, quite famously. That was the night of your election victory. The room's packed, the crowd's going wild for you. You gave your election victory speech. And I remember watching you come, after you'd finished, you tried to come down off the stage and you tried to walk through the crowd to go and see your friends who were there. And you couldn't move. All of a sudden, the office of Prime Minister just descended upon you. There's police, there's cameramen, there's journalists, everyone's swarming you. And I remember watching you and thinking, wow, the weight of the office happens quickly when it happens. I want to ask you what that moment was like for you. And did you feel that weight on your shoulders all of a sudden? How did it feel?
It was an extraordinary moment. I actually go back a little bit further, which is when I came out of my house from watching the election night coverage play out. And I got the phone call from Mr. Morrison, and we went through that, and I took that away from my family and friends. We only had 8 people there in the house, and I said, it's done. And there was this moment of, okay, it's happened. I'm now the Prime Minister. And I went outside. I didn't expect there were hundreds of people in the street, which is a pretty ordinary suburban street.
Yep.
In Marrickville, and there was this moment which was, okay, it's really happening. And then on the night, I very consciously wanted to go to a local RSL, a club that was familiar to me. We'd had my book launch, had been launched there by Bob Hawke, and we'd had a number of nights there, pretty good restaurant there.
It's a great club.
And I didn't want to go into the CBD, into one of the fancy hotels. So I thought that was important as well as a way to start what I hoped would be the new government. But it does happen pretty quickly. But it was very daunting, but I didn't have that much time to think about it. I had not prepared my speech in advance, so we had to I dictated the speech to someone sitting on my floor of the lounge room. So Katie typed it all in, she printed it out, and then I made one then read through and check. But some of it as well on the night was spontaneous.
What was your dominant emotion when you're giving that speech?
Pride that Labor had won, which succeeded in winning the election. I had said in 2019, I'd given a speech at the National Press Club outlining kicking with the wind in the last quarter. I went through the 4 phases in which we would do. I went through what our priorities would be. We had shown incredible discipline, I think, as a party and a movement to get through that. I had received extraordinary support from the movement, but it was also a sense of relief. I genuinely thought that the Morrison government wasn't worthy of re-election, and I thought it would descend into even worse condition afterwards if they were successful again. And so it was a sense of relief, but also that sense of opportunity that now we had a chance to really make a difference, to implement the agenda that we'd put forward.
So Jackie's question really has highlighted the fact that all of a sudden you've got immense power. What's the best thing about having that power as Prime Minister now?
Power is defined by its use. So using it judiciously, not overusing it for its own sake, using it in the interest of the objectives that you want to achieve. So already we have turned around Australia's positioning on climate change. We've gone from being a pariah in the naughty corner with 2 or 3 countries saying no, to actually engaging with our neighbours, but also engaging with the economic opportunities that are there from the transition to a clean energy economy.
And so if those are the pluses, what are the minuses? At a personal level, what's the downside or the worst thing of having that power?
The lack of freedom, the not being able to just drop into the pub by yourself and catch up with someone. Time is the biggest shortage. The demands on my time are quite extraordinary. The pressures that are there as well. But that's a small price to pay for the incredible privilege that I've been given, and it's not something that I take for granted.
Still on the question of power, do you find that now that you've got this power, great power, that people tell you what you want to hear more than they did before, and how do you guard against that?
No, I don't. I don't find that that's the case, and I think that one of the advantages that the government has is we were the most experienced incoming Labor government in history since Federation. So people who were familiar with each other, comfortable with each other, and I've learnt over a period of time how to chair a meeting to get the best out of the group. And that means sometimes holding back on your views, listening to what people have to say before you come in. Because when you're the Prime Minister or the Leader of the Opposition, you can, from time to time, have undue influence. And you want people to put forward views honestly and clearly to you. And I've always surrounded myself with people, whether it be in the Cabinet in key positions, all of the key people are quite happy to put forward their views to me, but also in my own office. There are people here who started work with me. Tim Gartrell, my Chief of Staff, started working with me in 1996. There are a number of people who I went to university with who are comfortable with saying exactly what their views are, and that is what I want. With the public service, the changes that we made, bringing in someone like Glyn Davis to be the head of Prime Minister and Cabinet, a former head of Premiers in Queensland, a former Vice-Chancellor, someone who is of great experience, someone who is doing the job because he wants to make a difference for the country. And we have, in terms of the people in the public service, I have confidence in those senior people like Stephen Kennedy and Jenny Wilkinson as heads of Treasury and Finance, that they'll put forward their views strongly as well. And I've encouraged that culture in the public service. I think it's been diminished in recent times by a lack of respect. I want ideas to be coming forward from the public service. I want ideas as well from the business community, from unions, from civil society as well. No one has all the answers, and we need to, in these challenging times, be prepared to listen, engage and maximise that input, because you'll get better outcomes.
So the death of Simon Crean, I think, makes it natural to reflect on the way in which politics is practiced, the way in which it's important to win, but also to keep personal integrity in the manner in which it's conducted. What do you think are the lessons from the way in which Simon Crean conducted himself as a leader?
The lesson is that if you have the integrity that Simon Crean had, tragically at the end of a life that was cut short, he has respect across the board. And you've seen that outpouring of grief and genuine emotion as a result of that respect about who he is and the sort of person he was. The other thing is that Simon was justifiably, of course, disappointed in not leading Labor to an election in 2003. He got up, dusted himself off, kept going. looking forward, being positive, understanding that politics is a difficult business.
Because politics can mess with people's brains when they lose power, can't it? I mean, you've seen that.
I've seen it, and the person who replaced him as leader in Mark Latham is, I think, tragically an example of that. Someone who's a much more diminished figure than he was at that time in 2003, 2004. And I think that's really unfortunate. Simon Crean is someone who, I stood in a ballot for Deputy Leader of the Labor Party. He not once was there any rancour. He accepted that outcome. He was disappointed by that. But he can't have been more supportive of my position when I became Labor leader. And from time to time we'd have a chat. We had dinner in France last year. We caught up just about a month ago in Melbourne, and he was someone who was always willing to offer advice and to pass on the wisdom that comes with experience.
Mm-hmm. PM Simon Crean famously argued against the invasion of Iraq in 2003, but he was very much pro the United States alliance. You also spoke out against the war in 2003. Now, 2 decades later, you've committed Australia to AUKUS. So the obvious question now is, would you speak out against US military action if it was in our national interest?
Absolutely. Australia must always stand up for our national interest. And the other thing is that being a friend, an ally, which Australia is of the United States, means not just going along and being subservient. It means actually telling the United States where you think it's made a position that you disagree with. An example of that at the moment is that on Julian Assange, I've made very clear that I have a different position from the United States. I've advocated that and will continue to do so. And I think that's the job of, it's a bit like the answer to a previous question. True friends around me will tell me if they think I'm getting something wrong. That's how you need to build a relationship of trust as well. And I've built a very positive relationship with President Biden and senior members of the Biden administration. We're very comfortable with each other, and that means that you can have the sort of discussions which we need to have in today's very uncertain world where you do have strategic competition in our region.
So let's talk about the purpose of power and what you seek to do now that you have it, starting with the economy. I thought I'd ask you about something Kevin Rudd famously said in 2007, that he was an economic conservative. How would you describe yourself?
I think I am someone who believes in economic growth. I believe in market forces, but I don't believe in them being allowed to just let rip. I think there are times where you need intervention into the economy in order to address market failure and to address equity issues in particular. And an example at the moment is in the energy sector where you have had an intervention that we couldn't have anticipated because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. You had this massive spike. So we put a cap on prices between us and state governments on gas and coal prices. Now, that's not something that we anticipated we would do upon coming into government, but you need to be prepared to use the power of the state to intervene in the interests of the nation, and we did that. There's a need as well to, I think, recognise that the next remaining years of this decade will really shape Australia for decades to come. Whether we take advantage of the fact that we can be a renewable energy superpower, if we miss the opportunity that's there at the moment from critical minerals and from the new economy and that transition, we missed some of it. by exporting our minerals without value adding. Why is it that solar panels are produced almost 90% in one country? There's not a solar panel produced in the world that doesn't have Australian intellectual property into it, usually ANU or UNSW. The products that go into a solar panel are all here. We should be making more things here. We have an incredible opportunity to make batteries here, to have advanced manufacturing here. And my vision is of cleaner, cheaper energy, powering advanced manufacturing, and with Australians having the skills to fill those jobs here. I think that is very much part of where we need to head. And whether we can do that or not will be determined by the remaining years of this decade.
Yeah. And so we're in a slump at the moment, or an economic slowdown at the moment that's got everybody concerned about how to actually lift ourselves out of that. The Reserve Bank Governor, Philip Lowe, is talking about the need for higher productivity. That's something Labor's talked about before, that Kevin Rudd talked about in 2007. What is your plan to increase growth through increasing productivity?
Well, it's a multifaceted plan. It's looking at the nature of the workforce. There's a low-hanging fruit in some areas. Women's workforce participation. Our childcare plan is a plan for boosting productivity through workforce participation and population. The 3 Ps of growth are there, and that is something that we're very much aimed at. And indeed, the figures show already that the policy being projected and being put in place is already having an impact, with not just more women in the workforce than ever before, but overwhelmingly that being channeled towards full-time jobs. So that's one area. Better infrastructure investment is critical as well. That's why we're having the review. There are 800 infrastructure projects in the pipeline from the former government. Now some of those, frankly, were just roundabouts and small, very tiny projects. They're not nation-building projects. How do you boost productivity through things like, there are some, Western Sydney Airport, the urban rail projects in our capital cities will do that as well. Congestion busting projects, those last mile in between on the way to a port, so that Port Botany, we had a project that still hasn't been completed where for years there's one line in to the port and one line out. So you can't have a train going in while a train's going out in that last period. That makes no sense. So making sure that you prioritise those issues as well. Better use of new technology, the work that Ed Husick's doing through the National Reconstruction Fund. How do we allow existing industries to transform and to become more efficient? How do we also bring in new industries that will bring those new opportunities as well? All of those are productivity enhancing measures. There's not a single button that you can press. You need to do all of the above to get more out of not working people harder, doing things better, more efficiently. During the campaign, I said that we needed an economy that works for people, not the other way around. And that's very much my philosophy, and that goes straight to the productivity agenda.
You got a question the other day from Sky News. You were at one of their forums, and it was a question about your second-term agenda. And I thought, well, it's a little early to be asking about that, but on reflection...
Indeed. Never too early.
On reflection, some of the issues that you're dealing with are incredibly complicated, and time is required, and you know that from previous governments. Tax, for instance, do you think the tax system is working properly at the moment?
Well, obviously there could be improvements in the tax system and improvements in the way that our economy functions. And what we do is we work those issues through. We're working through education, for example. One of the...
I think you've just changed the subject from tax.
Well,
so is that because tax is quite a challenge?
Well, of course it's a challenge, but it's also the case that's just one part of the economic agenda. And our second term agenda, just as last time round, we had a range of points that we could point to over and over again that people understood we were going to do. We were going to take action on climate change. We were going to have cheaper childcare. We were going to have a fairer economy that worked for people, not the other way around. We were going to increase women's economic participation and have that as part of our agenda going forward. We're going to re-engage with the world as well. Now, we've done all those things, but we need to do more. So one of the things that my government is doing is, just as in aged care and childcare and veterans affairs, these issues, we had studies, we did work, and we built on them going up. You can see as well in the education agenda that I see a big part of a second-term agenda that Jason Clare's working on, early learning through to school, through to TAFE, which we've done a lot of work on, 480,000 fee-free TAFE places. Now the big review that's going on universities as well. I had a discussion with Jason about that just today, and Jason will be speaking at the National Press Club in a few weeks' time. It's a big part of an agenda. The job of reform is never done. My government will not be a government that just occupies the space.
Is structural tax reform part of that proposed agenda, though? Or is it on the cards?
Well, we'll examine those things. We're trying to get through at the moment, in terms of the economy, the issues that the economy is facing, which is about how do we take pressure off families of cost of living without putting pressure on inflation. So that's been the focus that we've had. That was the focus of our budget, returning the revenue gains to the bottom line, turning around a $78 billion forecast deficit into a $4.2 billion forecast surplus. I think there are a range of challenges that we have. Taxation is something that will continue to be examined. Housing is a major issue as well, that will continue to look for ways in which we can address those issues. I think one of the challenges for the government is that we inherited on so many fronts a vacuum. There hadn't really been any policy to address housing supply. There certainly hadn't been any policy to address climate change. 22 announced, none landed. So we're trying to deal with all of these issues in a way that is measured, that is orderly, that is not a government of surprises, but a government that says what we're going to do, outlines how we're going to do it, and then gets on with the job of delivering it.
Just quickly on young Albo, Sydney University Albo, in the economics department, during a pretty torrid time in the economics department of Sydney University, it was an era of fairly hard left ideas, and you were in the Labor left before the fall of the Berlin Wall. What was the event that sort of changed your thinking about the market economy and big interventionist government policy from those radical ideas to what you are now?
I studied... But I studied the full spectrum of economics at Sydney Uni. There were two streams. I did both of them. I did the economics, what would be seen as the conservative stream, under people like Peter Groenewegen and Warren Hogan, the advisor to the Howard government, as well as the progressive stream, political economy stream, under people like Ted Wheelwright and Frank Stilwell. I read everything. I was a great reader, and I believed in reading all of the classics right across the spectrum, from Keynes and Schumpeter and to Friedman and others on the conservative stream. And so I think that markets can be a democratic forum as well of expression, and they can be a great allocator of resources. And so I've always had that view. I remember speaking at a forum in Newtown. It was very much a broad left forum, and saying what was regarded as heresy, that markets were a democratic form of expression, because I believe that they are. If you want to determine what the best chocolate bar is, the market will tell you. You won't get that by just talking to two. What's selling the best? Tim Tams are good biscuits because people buy them. That's the market in operation, and then resources are allocated to it. But I've also always believed in that there's a role for government, there's a role for the state in providing people with opportunity and making sure that people don't get left behind. So from my own experience, my lived experience, growing up, a single mum who had access to a pension because of decisions that were made by the Whitlam government, that had a house because the city council was controlled by the Labor Party that believed in public housing, and so there was a substantial amount of housing around there. She was quite ill, and I saw the difference that good health care made to her. So I see that on election night. I spoke about the Labor Party's job as being about just widening the doors of opportunity further for people to be uplifted. And I see that as about not just helping individuals. I think greater equity and people being able to participate fully in society benefits the whole of the society. So a program like the NDIS benefits the individual, benefits families of that individual, but it benefits Australia as well.
People often mellow over time, and I'm not sure whether it's right to describe you as a radical in younger years in the Labor left. Would you have described yourself as a radical back then? Have you become less radical? Is there a point in time or an event in history that made you less radical?
I think certainly in the way that I conduct my politics, I am much more moderate in the way that I engage with people. When I grew up, I don't think I'd met, I've said this before, I don't think I met anyone who certainly admitted to voting Liberal. You know, you were, the council housing estate were all Catholics, because a lot of Catholics worked for the council. They all voted Labor, and they supported rugby league on Saturday. And that was the culture that I grew up in. And I hadn't met, it was quite a culture shock for me going to Sydney University with people wearing their, old school ties with mugs tied to them around their their neck, having a drink from what school they were from. Like the school I went to.
So you're a total outsider.
Absolutely. There was no one from my actual class went to Sydney Uni. So when I walked in to economics at Sydney Uni, I didn't know anyone in my class, and that was quite a culture shock. But it also opened up things for me as well, in terms of that people are just people, and you can be a wealthy person or someone who's really struggling and still have the same values, still have decent values. So I tell the story in my book about, written by Karen Middleton, about a friend of mine, Mark Jones, who his father was at the time the mayor of Hunters Hill, so probably not a card-carrying socialist. And I went to his house, and he was at my place one night having dinner, and I was cutting up my mum's food because she couldn't use a knife or fork with her hands crippled up with arthritis. And he said to me, afterwards, it was like, how long has that been the case? And I was like, what? Because to me, that was just the way that it was. I'd grown up that way. And his mum worked for Dr. David Champion, who was a specialist, orthopaedic surgeon, specialising in rheumatology, and he organised, through his mum, an appointment for my mum to go see him, and that changed her life. He reconstructed her hands, her feet, put metal joints in, effectively long operations. But it meant that for my mum, who died when she was 65, she was fitter and more mobile and healthier when she was 60 than when she was 40. Now, that's about, that's a little bit of a story about class too. She just didn't have access, didn't have anyone around to know how to navigate the health system through to get the right care that she needed. But instantly someone from a different world, a world that I now inhabit, was able to get that. But they can't have been more helpful in reaching out. And so I think as you get older in life, I now have a very broad range of friends, including some very successful people in the business community as well as leaders of the trade union movement. And I think in this position that I hold now, it's important that I engage with people across the spectrum. I hear that different views, whether formal or informal, and I think that strengthens my capacity to understand where people are coming from. And I think that is one thing that you get as you get older, the capacity to put yourself in someone else's shoes, not necessarily to agree with them, but to say, well, I get that perspective of where they're coming from and I respect it.
Let's talk quickly about The Voice, because we know that it is your passion. It's now at a pivotal stage. It's leaving Parliament, it's going to the people, and there's been a lot of talk about the polling and the decrease in support generally, but we want to talk about the purpose of The Voice. Just very quickly, there's been many organisations that have been set up for First Nations people to try to help them. Why would this one be any better?
That's why constitutional recognition is important, because bodies have come and gone. And because of that experience, Indigenous Australians, when they met at Uluru with the Constitutional Convention, said they wanted recognition, but they wanted one that was a particular form. They wanted a mechanism that wasn't just about the symbolism, which is important, but they wanted a voice to government to be able to advance their interests. And I think a national voice that was elected by Indigenous people themselves, that would be able to advocate on their behalf in order to close the gap which is there. 8-year life expectancy gap in infant mortality, health outcomes, incarceration rates that mean that a young Indigenous male is more likely to go to jail than university. We need to do better than that. And the fact that there will be a referendum and Australians, I hope, vote yes in that referendum means that that yes vote will in itself, I think, lift up Indigenous people. Will say to them that they are respected, but it will also give weight, I think, to the country. I think that Australians will wake up the day after and feel that the greatest country on earth just got a little bit greater.
Well, the voice, the referendum can go either way. Do you think it's so important that the voice is set up that regardless of the outcome of the referendum, it's important to actually legislate a voice so that it exists, even if it's not enshrined in the Constitution?
Well, of course, the former government had the opportunity to do that, and they didn't. Now Indigenous people have asked for this. This isn't something that is a government idea. It's certainly not my idea. It is something that has come from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people themselves after thousands of discussions and meetings and processes. So I'm just focused on the referendum. I sincerely hope that yes is successful, And I have faith in the Australian people. I think that when people focus on what this is about listening and about consultation and also about recognition, then they will vote yes.
And does a no vote then mean that you can't really legislate a voice anyway, because that would be going against the outcome?
Oh, look, I'm not going to get into the hypotheticals. I'm focused on a referendum that votes yes, that puts this change in place. And one of the things that will, of course, then happen is that there will be legislation. And when that occurs, I want to get as much consensus as possible across the Parliament so that there's very broad agreement about how it will operate. I think it will be like the apology to stolen generations. That was resisted. There were a range of arguments put about what the consequences of the apology would be, none of which were true. None of the negatives were there. It was an uplifting moment for the nation. And this will be even more so, because this will be something that the nation will own. The change will be owned by people, regardless of what way individuals will vote, and they will make up their own decision. And I respect, of course, you've got to respect the outcome of democratic processes. But I do think this is an incredible opportunity.
We're seeing increasingly shrill rhetoric around the debate on The Voice, and we're seeing misinformation creeping into that debate. Does that personally upset you or distress you or anger you?
I do find it really disappointing is the word that
Does it make you mad though?
I think it's important that I don't engage in that way, because I don't think that's going to be helpful.
Do you have to hold yourself back?
Well, I have to.
Do you swear and curse in private?
No, well, I just think that for some of the arguments that have been put forward, which people know when they're saying it isn't true. The idea that the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice is going to sit around and go, okay, where should the next base be for defending Australia? The people putting that forward know that that's not the case. And the people saying it might advise the Reserve Bank of Australia know that they're in a position of power, the people who I've heard use that argument, and they can't advise the Reserve Bank of Australia, let alone any group outside of this process. I think that with what's disappointing is that with positions of authority, you have a responsibility, in my view, to show leadership and to engage in a way that is worthy of the office that people hold. And Indigenous people have been so respectful. I do think this is a very gracious and generous request. This is the equivalent of walking into a room and putting out your hand to shake someone, which is the Australian tradition, a hand of friendship, and saying, good to see you, can we discuss some issues? And I think that that hand should be grasped. That is the way that I see this process, and I sincerely hope that Australians do.
We're almost out of time. We just need to go to the most important topic of today's podcast, Taylor Swift tickets. Now, have you secured them, and did you jump the queue because that's un-Australian behaviour?
I haven't secured them. I won't commit to not making a call to get Taylor Swift tickets.
We knew this is the real scoop.
This is it. This is it. Undue influence here.
Yes.
So just one call is going to be enough.
I want to know who's at the end of this phone call. Is it Taylor herself?
Well, I shouldn't say, should I? But I'm sure that I may well be able to get a ticket, and it's important because my son, who is who's 22 and who's currently on a backpacking tour around Europe with his girlfriend. I spoke to him a couple of nights ago, and his one obsession wasn't how we were going or what he was doing. It was, can you get me Tay-Tay ticket?
So you found a way to get him back home. There are some benefits to power after all.
Well, he'll be back next month, and he's having a great time, and it's a very good thing that he's doing that. But the thing about Taylor Swift is, I think that she is a great role model. Shake It Off is a feminist anthem, and her later material like Folklore and Evermore are just fantastic albums. She is a great songwriter. She's really, I think, very incisive in her thoughts on the human condition and on relationships between people. And I liked her documentary as well.
Great documentary. I mean, we're big Swifties
terrific.
at this podcast.
Well, I hate to interrupt, but I'm yet to discover this, but I'll make the attempt.
You should. You listen to the new album too.
Yeah, I'll do your playlist.
Midnight.
It'll ping it to you on Spotify.
I can fix it for you.
Yeah.
I have my playlist. It did stand out a bit because my playlist is normally things like Midnight Oil and The Jam and New Order and
more masculine rock choices.
A whole lot of choices. In the middle of it all, though, I like having songs that people can sing along to. So that sometimes you have to make up for a lack of talent by participation. So I will do Iggy Pop's The Passenger that has I'll let you sing this, Jackie, the chorus. Here we go. She can't do it.
It goes na 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 na
Oh,
na
yeah.
La 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 la.
Sorry,
la,
I stand corrected.
Yeah. And things like that.
Yep.
That people can sing along to.
Yep. And so
The Angels, Am I Ever Going to See Your Face Again? That
Yep.
we won't say
We cannot
what
say
people
that on
sing
the
along
podcast.
to. But it gets audience participation. But you put Taylor Swift on, everyone dances. Mm-hmm. Everyone dances, and everyone really enjoys it. Mm-hmm. And they all even do the hand movements too.
Oh, yeah.
It's a good thing.
It is a beautiful thing. It has been an absolute pleasure to have you on our podcast. You're the biggest celebrity we've ever had, even including Shane Wright. Don't tell him that. We will see you at the Taylor Swift concert. You'll be in better seats than us, but hopefully you'll sort of give us a wave from the top table there.
I'm not sure where I'll be, but
you'll be
it's
there.
actually that's a downside of. You were asking me about the downside of the experience. I saw King Stingray at the Enmore Theatre on Saturday night, who were absolutely fabulous, and I would have loved to have been down
In the mosh pit?
in the mosh pit,
Yeah.
on the floor there at the Enmore, and instead I'm,
The AFP won't allow that kind of thing anymore.
well. It makes their life a little bit more difficult.
These are the sacrifices that you make for power.
Indeed.
Thank you so much, Alba.
First world problems.
Yeah, we've
you.
really enjoyed having you. Thank you so much.
Terrific. Thanks, guys.
Cheers.